ahead and get started. I'm sure people will continue to join. We had a number of registrants today, and so we will continue to admit people as we start. So welcome to the April Arch Acadiana Housing Alliance joint meeting. And yes, I know it's May. Thank you for your patience. We wanted to have all of our panelists with us for this discussion today. So we did move this meeting back 1 week. It will not change the regularly scheduled May General Arch meeting on the fourth Thursday of this month as well. So just from a housekeeping perspective, a reminder to mute yourself when you aren't speaking. Please introduce yourself, drop your name, and if applicable, your organization or company affiliation in the chat. We're going to have time for Q&A and open conversation at the end. So that's an opportunity to take yourself off mute or drop your questions in the chat. A reminder that this is being recorded. Thank you to AOC Community Media for always making sure that our meetings are accessible to everyone. If you'd like to access this meeting later, I'll drop the link in the chat. It's been especially helpful in the last month as we've shared part 1 of this discussion with those who wanted to catch up. So again, thank you, AOC. Some updates. Arch is beginning to sunset our 2-year plus ESG-CV program that's enabled us to house, thousands of people in emergency shelter. We moved about 1,300 so far into permanent housing. This project's going to end at the end of August. We've seen tremendous growth. As you know, we went from 1 employee to about 25. And we're committed to seeing this program through to its conclusion, but we're also keeping our eye on the future. And we're going to be sharing in coming meetings what Arch is looking forward to at the end of 2022 and 2023 and beyond. It's really an exciting time for our organization. We've been working hard to get the Hearthstone Community Shelter proposal in front of our local and state elected officials. I am cautiously optimistic that there are some developments on that front on the horizon. A reminder that those of us, who are in this space regularly know that we hear most from our elected officials when they hear from their constituents. So, when someone from their district calls or emails or expresses concern. So a reminder that if you felt so inclined, please contact your parish council, city council, state representatives. We need you. I'm optimistic that a shelter solution is going to come to be, but regardless, it can't be for lack of elected officials hearing about it. That is ultimately something that we are able to control. Turning toward the Acadiana Housing Alliance, we've been evaluating what the next chapter, what the next phase is going to look like as well. And that's been in part due to ideas that have bubbled up as a result of last month's conversation, which was part 1 of an analysis on adjudicated properties with the current Christiaan Mader. And also I am going to drop in the chat the 3rd of the 3-part series that Christiaan focused on last month when he came in and joined us for that meeting. It was published, the 3rd section that I'm about to put in the chat right now was published the week after our meeting. If you haven't read it, I know that you'll enjoy it. He alluded to some things he was going to include, but it's chock full of information. So please check it out. Also, please watch for more interesting things coming from the Acadiana Housing Alliance, and let me or Melinda Taylor know if you'd like to get involved in ways that are additional to attending the bi-monthly meetings. And I'm going to drop our email addresses in the chat because it occurred to me that perhaps you don't know how to get in contact with us. So there are our email addresses. Please don't hesitate. I heard today, please keep an eye on Senator Barrow's SB 249 that advanced out of the local and municipal committee yesterday unexpectedly. It requires local governing authority to implement a permitting process for individuals and businesses who open a home which serves 6 or more individuals. So I know that I'm reading it verbatim, but what it could effectively do is make it difficult or create significant liability for those who are operating shelters, group homes, and transitional housing. So it's something that we really need to keep an eye on. Again, that's SB 249, and of course, more as that develops. And then lastly, a reminder that it is Hurricane Preparedness Week, and that's all I'm going to say about that. But just a reminder that we're about a month out. Today we have the pleasure of having an esteemed panel to discuss adjudication from the perspective of practitioners at a more granular level. We were teed up beautifully by Christiaan last month. And our panel today includes Kirk Trahan of Lafayette Consolidated Government, Melinda Taylor of Habitat for Humanity, Lafayette, RJ Fonseca, also with his affiliation with Habitat, and Dr. Chris Williams from Sun Chodo. So if you don't mind, I know that you all will do a much better job of introducing yourself. So if you don't mind, please do that and share with us your connection to the adjudication process. And Kirk, if you don't mind, we can start with you.
Again, my name is Kirk Trahan. I think you did a good job. There's not a whole lot to my title description. My name is Kirk Trahan. I'm a planner with Consolidated Government in the Community Development and Planning Department. And I have been assigned the task of administering the Adjudicated Properties Disposition Program. And like I said, I think you pretty much did a good job of describing who I was.
Thank you so much. Melinda?
I'm Melinda Taylor, the Executive Director of Lafayette Habitat for Humanity, and we have since 2019 been applying, now that we have an ordinance that allows disposition for adjudicated properties that we could redevelop in the core neighborhoods where we're building. And after the initial pilot project, we put in 2 applications then, and since then have applied for, I believe it's 16 additional properties, and have received them through the council donation and cleared the title, and we'll be selling our first home that was built on a formerly adjudicated property within the next couple of weeks. Wow. So we are actually using the ordinance to help benefit the neighborhoods where we're working.
Thank you. RJ? Is he with us? I saw him log on.
Yeah, RJ's here. You may be on mute, RJ.
Well, let's go ahead and go to Chris, and then we can come back if a little bit later. Chris?
Okay, great. Hello, everyone. My name is Chris Williams. I'm with Sun Chodo. We are a small nonprofit that works in the 8 parish region in Southwest Louisiana, working with communities that have been affected by adjudicated properties and trying to work with, quote unquote, the others who have often been left out of the equation of dealing with properties and losing properties, and just trying to work along with all of the other great partners on the call to ensure that our fellow citizens have safe, sanitary, and secure housing.
Thank you. And RJ's back. Can you introduce yourself and let us know your connection to the adjudication process?
Hi, yes. Apologize. My laptop rebooted real quick. My name is RJ Fonseca. I am an attorney here in town, and also chair of the Lafayette Habitat for Humanity. I became involved a couple of years ago with the adjudication process on behalf of Habitat, and have been working through the beginning stages with Kirk to have the properties transferred from LCG to the affiliate, and then thereafter proceeding through the court system with quiet title actions to have the properties insurable with title insurance.
Thank you. Kirk, I know that most people did come to part one, but in the event that they didn't, just as a leveler, can you briefly explain what an adjudicated property is?
Going to go ahead and try and brief as possible, as brief as possible. All of our property taxes come due December 31st of any given year. January 1st, you're tax delinquent. Over the course of the next several weeks, the Sheriff's Department, who collects property taxes for the parish, and LUS, who collects property taxes for the city, they start to go ahead and populate this list of folks that didn't pay their property taxes and are tax delinquent. They start doing that in March. They send letters out all these folks, send letters out to all of these folks, run an ad in the paper advising them that there's going to be this tax title sale that will be held in June, wherein the tax title to their property is going to be sold. This is not the actual deed to your property, rather it is a tax title, and some folks will treat that as an investment opportunity. When we get to that tax title sale, which, like I say, is a formal process conducted by the Sheriff's Department and LUS, if at that tax title sale somebody doesn't bid on your tax title, in essence pay your property taxes, if that doesn't happen at the tax title sale, then by law, the default tax title holder is local government, and it is at that moment that a property becomes what we call adjudicated.
Okay. So what do you see as the common reasons, and I'm going to open this up to the whole panel, but what do you see as the common reasons that properties enter adjudication? And I'd really like to make sure that we are speaking to both the direct reasons that properties enter adjudication and also investigating sort of the systemic reasons. So Kirk, you want to give us what your boots on the ground perspective is?
I think probably at the end of the day, the most prominent explanation is that grandma and grandpa have passed away. Grandma and grandpa have passed away. Mom and daddy have passed away, and the heirs just aren't paying attention to the property. Folks don't realize that when the primary property owner passes away, that you lose homestead exemption. So if grandma and grandpa had homestead exemption previously, when they passed away and somebody else started living in the home, well, now you've got a property tax that's due. And previously, grandma and grandpa never paid a property tax. So it just, I think at the end of the day, and then, there's so many heirs involved with the properties. At the end of the day, I think it probably just a lack of attention, a lack of, I don't want to say a lack of sophistication, but it happens. It happened to, myself and my mom and my brothers and sisters. It happens in that we just don't know how these rules play out. And at the end of the day, tax bill gets sent, nobody pays attention to it. Maybe one of the other siblings was paying for it. Maybe one of the other siblings is living there and none of the other ones are, and they just don't pay attention to it. And it gets to June and the tax title gets sold, or the tax title doesn't get sold and it becomes adjudicated. Like I said, I think it's probably more often than not just the fact that mom and dad, grandma and grandpa have passed away and attention isn't paid to maintain the property. A will wasn't written, the succession wasn't done, and the property just falls into neglect.
Gotcha,
and I say that from the perspective of the ownership of the deed.
Thank you for that. Other people on the panel, what are your thoughts? Are there things you want to add to those common reasons?
Yeah, I just want to share very quickly the concept that there's a reason why the majority of adjudicated properties is located on the north side of Lafayette, and that's because and I'm going to use this term, there's a certain amount of ignorance that exists. And ignorance means not in a derogatory sense, just in a way of not knowing. And it's kind of expounding.
Simply a lack of knowledge.
Right, exactly. And that's expounding upon what Kurt was saying. So, what we've been trying to do is just to get inside of the community and let people know, what are their options? So many people say they don't know, or they haven't, they just didn't know. They wasn't aware of the new ordinance. The ordinance that we're currently operating on was worked on for over a decade before we were able to have the version that we have now. And so it's important that we all do what we do in our own wheelhouse, but recognize the fact that at the most prominent point is that the over 1,000 properties that are on the north side of Lafayette, particularly, we all have to collectively do whatever we can in the way that we can and within our own individual missions to make sure that those properties have go back into providing our citizens with affordable housing. So we have some great people on the call that's been doing this for years. You have new people like Sun Chodo that's getting in. And I guess my personal goal and our team's goal is to work to get that number down to something that's more manageable, to work with all of the entities on the call to, as expeditiously as possible, move so that we can address the housing issue in our city, in our community, because it has not necessarily been a priority locally, and we're about to see some things happen statewide finally, and hopefully that will allow us to have a paradigm shift to be able to effectuate change in a positive way. Always doing this with the sense of not doing it in the sense of a taking, but doing it in a sense to build community and increase the housing stock in our community.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Melinda, RJ?
Yeah, Taylor just mentioned in the chat, Taylor Robinson from Acadiana Legal Services. As many of you know, or may already know, they work with elderly and low-income folks, people who qualify for their services, to do pro bono legal work to help with these issues. So, that's one avenue that people have to get assistance with this. But I think, to Chris's point, I think there's really a need for education and community level outreach on the part of those of us who are kind of aware of some of these issues. When properties first fall into adjudication, at the neighborhood level, explore why that's happened. See if there's a way that maybe the individual or family whose property has become adjudicated could get back on track as owners of the property. But in our case, the properties that we've applied for have been adjudicated for a number of years. And the longer a property stays in adjudication, the more intractable the issues become with it, the more amounts build up that make it more difficult for the family to, or whomever owned it, to redeem it. So, I think it makes some sense to look at, as a community, how do we approach this proactively when properties first become adjudicated. So.
Thank you. RJ, you have anything to add?
I'll add this, and I think the question that Kirk touched upon was that when the properties fall into tax delinquency, that in June of the following year, they're presented at a tax sale. And those tax sales are incentivized in a lot of respects for in like an investment community or an investment stock to come in, acquire these tax deeds or tax sale certificates because there's interest accruing on those tax deeds. And then the owners have these opportunities to redeem the properties within 3 years. The investor in the tax deed receives their money back plus interest oftentimes. And then certainly an ownership interest after a 3-year redemption period. So I think that one question that I don't want to overlook is that, well, why are in fact there are clusters of adjudicated properties that are not going through the regular tax sale certificate process, where these are being purchased and then either redeemed or thereafter they're not being bid on. They're not being part of that sort of an investment type approach, and it's unfair because oftentimes they're very small tax delinquencies. So the value is set on the assessed value of the home for the amount of taxes. So if you're someone, and I know that there are groups from there's a really big group from Omaha, Nebraska, Omaha, that will come in in every parish of the state and put all sorts of money in these tax sales certificates. And the idea is that they want to get as much return as they can. And I think it's unfortunate because these properties get left. Well, I guess there's a double edge to that. One, they get left to the city. No one bids on them. I guess they either don't see it as a good investment opportunity, or the number of years that have transpired. but certainly there's I guess there's not a level playing field on how these properties initially are set up to be auctioned to have the taxes paid on them. So what unfortunately does happen is that they will be adjudicated, and those all of a sudden are no longer taxes that can be redeemed by a third party at an auction. They now are regulated to this other process, which really hasn't gotten off the ground. Except in the last, 9 years. And we're talking 30 years of this process where you now have just enormous amounts of clusterings of these adjudicated properties, which is unfortunate. I think that it's not, I think it's taken a very long time to get this to this place of perhaps bad policy and unfair an approach to having taxes paid or whatnot by auctioneers, so to speak.
So Kirk, just so that we understand, how many properties are we talking about in adjudication right now, and how long have they been there?
Let me go ahead and pull it up again. Actually, I went ahead and pulled the report up. As we speak, as of today, our handy little app that our IT people gave us, there are 1,241 adjudicated properties in Lafayette Parish.
Okay, well, we're going to wait for him to jump back on. And oh, there he is. Hi.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. As of today, there are 1,241 adjudicated properties in Lafayette Parish. Probably about 900. Let me see. Actually, if you give me a second, I can tell you the number in the city of Lafayette. We're running a little bit. Our computers run. The number within the city of Lafayette is 900 to 950. Of that 900 to 950 in the city of Lafayette, 91% of them will fall in either District 1, which is Pat Lewis's district, or District 5, which is Glenn Lazard's district. We've literally got a handful in Districts 2, 3, and 4. The overwhelming majority of the adjudicated properties in the city of Lafayette are in Districts 1 and 5. Properties that have been adjudicated for less than 3 years, we can't dispose of them. By state law, that's the redemptive period, and state law requires that those folks be given the opportunity to go ahead and redeem their property. So we can't run them through our process at that time. But this number of 1,241 does include some of those. From what I understand from the tax collectors, they anticipated the number was going to increase drastically this year due to COVID and the downturn in the economy. Mm-hmm. I think there were fewer than 100 new adjudications. They were anticipating there was going to be several hundred new adjudications this year, and this is going back to last June. Right. But we had fewer than 100.
Okay, well that's somewhat heartening.
Yeah, and that's it. Of the ones that are in their first year of adjudication, when those tax bills got sent out in October, November, I know the Sheriff's Department is doing this, and this goes to how do we avoid these numbers increasing. The Sheriff's Department, the tax collectors with the Sheriff's Department, and they're literally, when they send those letters out to those folks, letting them know they're tax delinquent, their property is going to potentially go up for tax title sale, they are on the phones calling each and every one, or making an attempt to contact each and every one of those property owners by phone to let them know, hey, this is what's going on, and you've got several months to go ahead and redeem your property. We're giving you a heads up. You've got the time to go. You can redeem it at any time. You will have some penalties. You will have some interest that have accumulated in the last couple of months since January 1st. But the Sheriff's Department and LUS very well may be making the same effort as well. but there is an attempt on their part. And to RJ's point, I think, was that the biggest problem is that those properties that are adjudicated beyond 3 years. And once you get to that point, the penalties, the interest, the taxes, and honestly, there may be some environmental, there may be some demolition sums that gets thrown on those tax bills. Those things start to add up, and it snowballs. I'll be honest with you, we did donate one of the properties that the last batch that we donated to Melinda over at Habitat. The property was worth $5,000. There was $50,000 worth of liens on the property.
Right.
So, you know, to the point that it's just not cost effective for the homeowners to. I mean, why would anybody invest $50,000 to retain a piece of property that's worth $5? It's
right.
not going to. I mean, they don't even have the $50,000.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, and I want to pivot this, I think, specifically to Melinda and to Chris. What are you seeing as the consequence of high numbers of adjudicated properties, both to the neighborhoods, right, but to the city at large?
Well, I guess I'll start. The obvious one is that it can take a neighborhood down if there's concentrations of properties that aren't being maintained, that are blighted, that are vacant, then you're going to have a cascade of consequences to the surrounding properties and to the neighborhood, which is not a good thing. And so there's that. And I think that's, you know, that's probably one of the main ones, and that they're stuck in that state because you know, there isn't the will or the mechanism to get them out of it. You know, becomes a long-term problem for especially the core neighborhoods in Lafayette.
And just to clarify, adjudicated and blighted are not necessarily synonymous, but they can be.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, not synonymous, but concurrent.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but by definition, an adjudicated property, even though the grass is cut, by definition, an adjudicated property is a blighted property. And to Melinda's point, like usually, you know, they go hand in hand. But just because it's blighted doesn't necessarily mean it's adjudicated, and just because it's adjudicated doesn't necessarily mean it's what we think of as being a blighted property. Gotcha.
And Chris, your thoughts on the consequences of the high number of adjudicated properties?
Sure. So I just to expound upon what was said. So I don't think there is a definitional difference maybe, but whether it's adjudicated, blighted, abandoned by the family, a house that is burnt down that hasn't been torn, that hasn't been torn down, it all leads to some form of gentrification from my standpoint. And so what we have is that when we have these voids in the community, we have investment groups, we have people that flip houses, we have people that come in and they acquire properties through whatever, which is their legal right to do, but it changes the makeup of communities, and that's what's happening. So I grew up on San Antonio Street in Lafayette, and what's happening is that investors are coming in, acquiring properties, renovating those properties, and increasing the rent. So we're seeing some investment take place, but the question is to what cost to the traditional and the oldest communities in the city of Lafayette. That goes to what investment hasn't been made in terms of our the inner city and the north side's infrastructure improvements, which is the oldest, and so the work that we do collectively, whether it's a small choto like Sun Choto or the larger groups like Habitat and everybody in between, the work that we do save these communities. And so having this discussion today hopefully will lead to more people being involved, more nonprofits being involved, so that we can ensure that the safe, sanitary, and secure housing is taking place, and it's not taking a place to where people are being put in a rent burden situation.
And Kirk, what is the cost to the city, the high number of adjudicated properties?
I mean, at the end of the day, you know, it really depends. Again, we respond to complaints. If folks are making complaints about a particular property, the grass needing cutting, you know, I think the number probably about $150 per lot. And I mean, just making the assumption, like I said, you do the math, multiply the 1,200 properties that we have that are adjudicated times $150 for, you know, for one grass cutting. And not every one of those properties is getting grass cut. Not everybody's making complaints about those properties. But the fact of the matter is, the $150, it has to be budgeted by Public Works. Because somebody has to cut the grass and somebody has to be paid to cut the grass. And then what ends up happening is that $150, well, you know, we may submit a bid to the property owner. Well, as we're seeing with adjudicated properties, the property owner is absentee, is deceased. They've moved away for whatever reason. They're not there, so nobody pays the bill. So we end up recording the $150 lien down at the clerk of court's office, which adds on to the tax bill. Somebody, you know, there's an abandoned house in your neighborhood, like Chris said. There's that burned down house, a house that got burned down, and folks start making complaints on it because people are doing the wrong thing at the house. Eventually, we'll go ahead and send housing inspectors out there. The house will get torn down. There's another $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 lien that gets put on the property that gets recorded down at the clerk's office. These are all dollars that get budgeted by consolidated government. And I'll be honest with you, you know, we're not going to expect payment on that because there's nobody there to pay the bill. Right. So that is a cost that, you know, annually gets budgeted to Public Works, gets budgeted to, quite frankly, I think, you know, our department, because we go ahead and we contract out to have somebody demolish the house. Those are all tax dollars. They get budgeted for the purpose of giving some kind of sense of orderliness to our older neighborhoods.
Can you tell us a little bit about the Adjudication Bureau? That's a relatively new thing, right?
Yeah, the adjudication, and I hope I know a little bit more than enough to get myself in trouble. It's that Adjudication Bureau has nothing to do with adjudicated properties. Okay. These are properties that, for whatever reason, are violating a code or series of codes that LCG has in our code of ordinances, whether it's, you know, you're operating a junkyard in a residential area. For whatever reason, there are things that you're doing that violate a series of codes. Somebody will make a complaint. We have a formal process where we notify that property owner that they are in violation of these codes, and it goes to our adjudication court. And that court will go ahead and issue remedies to the property owner that they have to abide by. And if they don't, we very well could do it. And again, I would assume that a lien, if there's $20,000 worth of cleanup that needs to be done on your property, that you've got a junkyard in a residential area, you're not zoned for that junkyard. We tell you to clean it up. You don't clean it up. We go back out there and we clean it up. I think that we take a lien, we place a lien on the property in that instance as well. So, like I said, these are properties that is there a possibility that they could be adjudicated? Yeah, but it's typically not properties that we think of as being adjudicated due to non-payment of property taxes. They're being adjudicated because they're violating a code or a series of codes that we have in our code of ordinances.
Thank you so much for that clarification. Melinda and RJ, when you spoke about how since 2019 that Habitat, I guess, began piloting the purchase of the adjudicated property. I was interested in your experience in the reactivation of these properties, and then maybe give us a view of what you think the quality of that disposition process is.
Well, I guess I'll just start by saying it's not really a purchase. What happens is you fill out an application and you have to give to Kirk, and then from there to the council, once he's cleared it, some notion of what you're going to do with the property. So you have to present a redevelopment plan for it. And, for us, it's providing affordable owner-occupied opportunities for first-time home buyers. So that's what we do. But once the council approves it and the donation goes through, there's a whole, sometimes fairly epic amount of work, as RJ can attest, to actually getting from that point to the point where we can build a house on it and convey it with marketable title to an owner. There's a whole clearance process that can be either more or less complicated depending on how long the property's been adjudicated, how many people are in the chain of title. So if somebody died a couple of generations ago and the property has not been in an orderly succession and it's got, what's the record number of people you've had to notify for one of ours so far, RJ?
I believe it's 28.
So,
wow.
And see, that's the low hanging-ish fruit of adjudicated properties. Some of them are much more complicated to clear, and we're now beginning to look at some of those to see if it's a winning proposition, because I'd say our average cost to clear is somewhere between $7,000 and $8,000. Because there is a lot of legal work that goes into that. And of course, that doesn't come free, even though we think RJ is great. It's a lot of hours and a lot of work. So, for us, it's, getting to the point where we can build a house on it and convey marketable title. And also, these properties, a lot of times, the city does their best to, do what Kirk was just talking about, keep them mowed, but that mowing is not to a very high standard, and there are frequently trees or brush or debris on the property that has to be cleaned up before we can start work on it, and that can run into the thousands of dollars. We're about to take down a dead tree on one of the properties that we're about to start building on. That's going to cost somewhere in the vicinity of $8,000 to $10,000 to get rid of. It's a huge, actually several trees. So there's those kinds of things that you have to consider in the process too, if you want to redevelop it. But in general, the longer it stays in there, the more complicated it is to get it clear.
We just had a question come through. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Kirk.
Melinda, if I can, Melinda's also had to go through the process where some of the properties they've taken on, like I said, they're not necessarily the zoning designation where the lot is located necessitated that Melinda go through a rezoning request, which added on to the cost of the entire proposition.
Yeah,
as well.
And we try to look at things from a kind of holistic perspective, and we applied for some lots and we've re-subdivided them. So we're about to start a small subdivision on Frank Street with 6 houses and probably a 7th to come on another property, but that was originally 3 lots. So there's, some process to get those re-subdivided into something that would be usable and appropriate and, would fit with the neighborhood, which is what we're always gonna want to do and see.
We had a question come through the chat that I think now would be a good time to address. So if a property is awarded by LCG, can the original owners pay taxes and keep the property before the title is cleared? Is that a risk for, say, Habitat?
That's going to be a risk for anybody. Real quick through the process, somebody's going to make application. We're going to pass a resolution authorizing a sale, or we're going to pass a resolution, pass an ordinance authorizing the donation to Melinda or Chris. Once that resolution or ordinance is passed, then we issue them basically what is a notice to proceed. They begin that notice process where they have to make a good faith effort to notify anybody that has a financial interest or is a tax party to that property that their rights are being terminated. So basically that 3-year redemptive period that I had mentioned at the beginning where we can't do anything, right. You're recreating that scenario where you have to give the property owners the opportunity to redeem their property. So this is going to be, depending on how long the property's been adjudicated for, it can either be a 60-day notice period or a 6-month notice period. So what's happening is you make notice, you make that good faith, you try to identify everybody, you run an ad in the paper, you put a sign on the property, and at the end of 60 days, RJ is going to give me a holler. He's going to say, Kirk, we're done with the notice process on this particular property. Can we get an active sale? We will issue an active sale give it to RJ. They're going to notarize it, sign it, notarize it, and record it. And this is all a race to the courthouse. So if in the process of RJ calling me up saying, Kirk, can we get the act of sale at the 61st day, the day after the notice period has ended, and the property owner goes and they redeem,
right?
It's redeemed. It's considered redeemed. At the top, we've got a list of priorities on how we want these properties to resolve themselves. And at the top of the list is redemption by the part of the original property owner. We want folks to keep their properties, and it has happened. It has happened on occasion. Actually, I won't say on occasion. It's happened several times that folks have come. I had one gentleman came up with $35,000 to go ahead and redeem his property. It happens. So yes, if the redemption happens prior to you recording that act of sale, it's redeemed.
Okay. Okay.
And that is the major risk that everybody is going to go ahead and take. Because again, as Melinda alluded to, it's an expensive proposition to go ahead and hire an attorney, which is what we absolutely recommend that everybody do. But that is the big risk, especially with the donation and the sales to adjoining property owners. That's the risk that you're going to run, that you could go ahead and hire an attorney, be out of pocket a couple of $1,000s, and somebody redeems, they've redeemed. That's the purpose of the notice period, is to give them that opportunity.
I hear you. Okay. So RJ, how do you see the process being improved?
Well, let me say this, that the process by which the ordinance is passed by the council, and then the party who is responsible for providing all of these notices. So the first step that they have to do is determine, well, who do we have to send these notices to? And the whole notice effort, it's a constitutional due process underlying that people should not be deprived of their property rights without notice and an opportunity to either object or to redeem. So there is a strong effort that you take these steps, and they're required. But by the same token, I really don't see how a lay person could figure out in the public records who, in fact, they need to notify. Yesterday, I got a call from the Louisiana Department of Labor on a 1986 lien that they had filed against a particular property because they were a lien holder on a property. They had an interest in that property, and we've sent notices to that. Now, there are occasions where we'll send 40 or 50 different notices. Sometimes we'll get calls back where they're letting us know that they received this on behalf of a family member who has passed away. And then they'll give us a list of those heirs and addresses that we'll look to determine. Then another effort of getting those notices out. So it's difficult for me to fathom how that process gets done without kind of a professional who, I guess, understands what it, in fact, having an interest in a chain of title of property constitutes. So that's one hurdle, and I don't necessarily know how you improve upon that because the constitutional notices do have to happen. The disposition ordinance in and of itself ultimately will arrive at a point where the party is receiving either a non-warranty deed or a non-warranty donation, depending on the status of the participant. And what that provides you is essentially a deed to the property. But what it doesn't provide you is that up until a point, you have a judicial determination that the property title has been quieted. And the purposes of a quiet title action is to extinguish any claims that any parties might have, such that they are deprived of their property. And there are a couple of ways that can happen legally if due process is not provided. So say, for example, you have a property owner who's never received any notice that the property was adjudicated, and that they did, in fact, make efforts to get the correct address situated with the tax assessor or whatever authority that might be. And now that they have someone else claiming ownership of the property by a non-warranty deed, they say, well, wait a second, that's not right. I'm entitled to notice of this. And they could certainly bring an action after all of this process is said and done to upset the adjudication and the transfer from LCG to the party. So you can never be secure in your ownership of that until you take it to the next step, which is this quiet title action, which essentially is almost the same thing. It's designed to allow parties the opportunity to be heard and bring their claims to challenge the adjudication in the first instance. Or it also allows you to bring claims that say, well, wait a second, I have 19 years of canceled checks where I've paid these taxes. Why in the world is this adjudicated? There's a mistake. Someone has received these and credited it to a different property. So the entire adjudication process could be upended by one individual with one fraction of an ownership interest bringing a claim to challenge the process from the kind of the first instance. So I would say that the accessibility to being able to maneuver through that, I think I just simply don't know, other than having, like, for example, I know that in Baton Rouge, they have a city attorney who often is involved in the notice requirements that are being done. So, but it still doesn't remove the part. It doesn't remove that from being a necessity. It's just that they have him on staff to somewhat try to identify who these interest holders are and how these notices need to be sent out. And I have heard a lot of, there's been some issues with that as well. So knowing, how the I mean, if the ordinance was passed and a list was provided that says, here, you need to do all this stuff, and here's the people that you need to do it for, like a list of those interested parties. I mean, certainly that would ease the process. That would make the real complicated nature of this simplistic. Like if there was an abstract provided and a title opinion provided with the ordinance, or in the early stages, that said, hey, here are all the interest holders. Now the safe harbor letters and the language for the signs and the language for the publication, that's all provided. That's all in statute. That's all very easy to do. It's the identifying and making sure the notice is happening correctly is kind of the tough part, in my opinion.
RJ, and thank you, RJ. If I could just mention real quickly from a small nonprofit standpoint, I know that we have a great amount of work being done by the local LCG employees who have been doing this for years, and they have, I don't know. I mean, I know that they do a lot in terms of where we were and then where we are today. And the question in my mind is, how do we work together as a team and all the partners that are on the call to increase the number, or give them the resources that are necessary to expedite whatever processes that we need to reduce that number that Kurt gave earlier to a more plausible number. So just did not want to let the time pass without thanking LCG and their initiatives. And as we move to the changes that RJ just made, but ensuring that our local government have the resources that they need to expeditiously move the property.
And I think that it's a good point. We, when we were framing what this conversation looked like, I think we thought it would be like a two-part series. And I think clearly this is just sort of the tip of the iceberg as far as what we need to be talking about. And then we haven't even gotten to talking about redevelopment authorities, right? And what they could be doing, what an active redevelopment authority could be doing as well. And so I think that right now we can commit to continuing this conversation at our subsequent meetings because it's obviously necessary. We had a question, Kirk, in the chat. So even when charitable groups step in to try to pay the taxes on at tax sale so that out-of-state companies don't get them, the city of Lafayette forces the tax sale purchaser, not the owners, to also pay to have the grass cut. This policy forces these properties into the hands of the out-of-state companies. Because ownership of property passes immediately upon the owner's death to his heirs, what steps does the tax assessor take to give notice to the new owners, not the dead person? I know that was...
I can answer that.
I would say, I think what's going to happen is in that instance, if I don't know that the tax assessors, and again, you're asking me to speak for the tax assessor to, how do they satisfy a process?
Right.
I don't know that there's going to be a communication from the tax assessor to an heir. But if that heir were to intercept grandma and grandpa's tax bill and pay that tax bill, I think at that point that the tax bill the next year at the tax assessor's office, they have the ability to go ahead and say, okay, Junior paid the tax bill on behalf of grandma and grandpa. Next year, we're going to be sending the tax bill to Junior. Because if you look, sometimes you'll see a physical address of a property, and then you're going to see a mailing address. Well, typically what we want to see is the physical address and the mailing address match up. Sometimes you're going to see the mailing address doesn't. And hopefully, if the taxes are being paid and you've got a different mailing address, that's because somebody in the family, one of the heirs, paid the tax bill and made the arrangements. Okay, continue to send the taxes to me because nobody is living in the house right now, or we're renting it out. And I don't know if I can depend on my tenants to go ahead and say, oh, look, we got the tax bill. Send the tax bill to me at my personal address. I'd be honest with you, I can't speak for the tax assessor to tell you whether or not, how that happens.
I appreciate what you can offer, and maybe that indicates that we need to get the tax assessor's office also involved in this conversation. Milton, I see your hand. I had one clarifying question first for you, Kirk. I thought, and the question in the chat is, I thought in 2012, Louisiana law changed redemption period from 36 months to 18 months of property that was blighted or abandoned, modeled after New Orleans local ordinance. Is that correct?
You're asking me to go ahead. I don't know. My understanding is that 36 months is the redemptive period.
RJ, do you have any?
Yes, it's still 36 months. The New Orleans ordinance there's a constitutional definition of what blighted is, and that constitutional definition does allow for once it's deemed that, for shorter redemption periods. To my knowledge, only New Orleans is operating, or maybe some of the other parishes that I'm just not aware of. But it's not a statewide adoption in a sense, at least for the purposes of what we're dealing with here today. I will say that I had the opportunity to depose the Lafayette Parish tax assessor recently. And to ask all these questions about what their process is in determining, and they attempt to do the best they can at updating the mailing addresses. They have mailing address cards. If they get information from an individual that a party has died, they'll notate next to their name estate. It's not information that they verify, and they themselves are not responsible at all for providing notice of any tax delinquencies or anything of that nature. That is the sheriff's department. So the tax rolls are essentially handed over to the sheriff, who provides all the notices and all the delinquencies, and also who collects all the taxes. So the so the tax assessor here doesn't do other than just the best they can at determining what those addresses are.
Right.
But what's interesting is that, and I don't understand this at all, but once a property falls into, say it's sold at a tax sale to an individual that's out of state, well, the next year, that tax certificate holder is the person who's going to get the tax bill. So they immediately stop sending notices to the parties who have an opportunity to redeem during that 3-year period. Now, they do send, the sheriff will send letters that says, hey, you got 3 years to redeem. You need to do this or you're going to lose your property.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen those letters. There's form letters, and all that's done by a third-party company, I think out of Shreveport. So they mail all that out. But it boggles my mind why the assessor in the next year that comes up would not send the tax bill to the original tax party and say, right, because they're almost like, okay, if you lose it in 1 year, you may not receive another letter until it's too late, frankly. So that's not a good process, I don't think.
No, and very possibly the next letter that they might get would be from RJ saying your property is going through this process.
Right.
Well, I want to respect everybody's time. I promised Milton that he could ask his question or make his comment.
Yeah, so the thing I'm listening to is, it goes kind of back to your question, Elsa, about how can we improve the process? And part of what I'm hearing is that we maybe need to kind of get a consensus on what do we consider an improvement to the process. Because, for example, one way to improve the process would be to find ways to get these properties redeemed quicker and more likely, but that would, in a sense, remove properties from access to, for example, Habitat for Humanity and others who want to acquire it to be able to do work. So, in a sense, we have there two competing interests. One is the other improvement would be, how do we get it into Habitat for Humanity's hands faster? But that's actually working against the original property owners. We have, in a sense, those two competing interests. How do we keep them from getting adjudicated at the beginning? Some of the stuff that Kirk mentioned and the other caller, person in the chat mentioned about the idea that the heirs are not hearing about the property and they're not here, and then they're going to hear it at the last minute. So, there needs, I think, before there's going to be any real change as far as ordinances or changes in policy, it's going to take clarifying what do we consider an improvement, because there are competing interests as far as what would be an improvement.
Thank you for that. Melinda, last comment, and then we got to wrap up for today at least.
And following up on what Milton said, I think what constitutes an improvement is going to somewhat depend on who you ask.
Exactly.
Because, there's a community perspective on this, and I think Alzina articulated it in the chat when she said, yeah, I know there was a property that was allowed to be redeemed. Somebody got it before it could completely become adjudicated and the ownership transferred, and it's still a blight on the neighborhood. Somebody redeemed the property, but then they don't take any next steps to make it an asset to the neighborhood.
And some of the other some other possible, quote, improvements, unquote, would actually lead to the gentrification that many people involved in this process are trying to avoid. So there really needs to be a consensus and a political will formed as far as what is an improvement to the process and what is actually something we want to avoid.
Right. Well, we're a little bit over time. This is clearly, like I said earlier, just the beginning of this conversation. I'm going to probably be appealing to the generosity of the panelists to see if they will join us again, possibly later this month or next month. I did want to share a couple of updates, and we will make sure we have more time next session to cross-share updates. But a reminder that today is Sola Giving Day. So if you're able, please go to solagivingday.org and donate to one or more of the wonderful housing or homelessness related organizations that are participating. If you aren't able to at the moment, please share your favorites on social media. Everyone counts and every action counts. So just wanted to remind everyone that there's a lot going on. And then again, if you'd like to engage with the Acadiana Housing Alliance or have ideas that you'd like to share, contact me, contact Melinda. Our emails are in the chat. I again want to thank so much the panelists today. Like I said, you're not off the hook yet, if you don't mind. We'd love to bring you back and continue this conversation. As Milton pointed out, I think that first we have to figure out what does improvements look like? What do improvements look like, right? And then have the conversation of how to engage those improvements. So again, thank you so much to everyone. Kirk Trahan, Melinda Taylor, Chris Williams, RJ Fonseca. I couldn't do this work without your generosity, and you all have a wonderful rest of the week.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, thanks.